everybody. My name's John Buck. I'm part of the Bevry community. Welcome. We're part of the Bevry study branch, and we're going to be discussing Iain McGilchrist's talk from, what was it? I forget the YouTube channel, and I don't have it open. But it was titled The Divided Brain and Human Behavior. It's actually kind of a lesser a video with lesser views than some of the other things that we usually talk about. But it's kind of just a straight up breakdown of his book, The Master and His Emissary, and kind of going through some of his core ideas that he's laid out there in that book. So I'm John. I'm joined today with Brett, our Pleasure of Doubt, as well as Nick. And we also have Daelric in the audio, but just without video as well.
Hi, guys.
Hi. All right. Do we want to sort of, I guess, go into some of the, I don't know, just basic outline, I guess, of what the talk was on?
Yeah, we can start out by talking about his talking about environment. People often refer to environment as a thing, and his point, he likes to say it's not a thing. It's a thing is something to be exploited, to be used, and also he says for there to be a thing, it has to be sort of one of many for something to be a thing. But there's only one environment, so It's not really a thing. It's I think he refers to it as more processes. I think he almost thinks there are no things, that there are no things, or what there are processes that are constantly flowing, living, changing.
Yeah, I think he goes as far as to argue that things are an illusion.
Yeah.
Right.
In fact, that's the topic to his newest book that he's working on, I guess, is that he's making the case that there are no things, only processes, and all constant things are in constant flux, sort of like Heraclitus.
Titled that The Matter with Things, right?
The Matter with Things. That's a good one.
Yeah. Also, if I remember,
I don't think it's out yet, but maybe it is. Because I remember he talked about it in his conversation with Jordan Peterson. It's like a densely packed, 30 minutes conversation, and he was still working on it then as well. That was probably like a year and a half ago.
I agree with his point that at least when we come to physical things are made up of other things, down to the particles that are moving, that are always moving, that are always in flux. I guess my issue with him is that maybe that just means that's how we should think about things, rather than say there's no things. But things are collections of other things, and until you get down to its most reductive, and something looks like it's not moving is actually moving. We just can't see it. Like we're here, we seem like we're still, but we're floating in space very, very fast. So I think it's just, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying this is a thing, but it's also made up of other things, and it's all in motion.
Well, I think the point he's sort of making is by calling something a thing, you're differentiating it from the rest of reality. But the thing is, things don't exist differentiated from the rest of reality. They exist because of the rest of reality. And so if you try to make that distinguishment between the thing and the environment, then you're like creating that distinguishment rather than actually observing an actual distinguishment there.
I think that's partially true, because I think that McGilchrist would say that very act of distinguishing in that way would be what the left hemisphere does with representation. Like he doesn't talk about representation, he talks about representation, because the recognition is also the recognition. It is taking the thing and then making it a part unto itself. But I think the thing why McGilchrist doesn't like things, the notion of things, is because it is tied to the ancient philosophical notion of substance. Like I was just looking, I just posted into the Discord server, Viveki's new Discord server, but if you go back and look at the definition of reality, where it initially comes from is the Latin word res, which means thing, but the older word from Proto-Indo-European indicated wealth or goods, and we still have that that way of talking about it because we talk about a man of substance being a man who is a wealthy man. And it was this notion, like the very idea of why owning property would make you a man of substance was because it was immutable and unchanging. Like the land never goes away in some sense. And so the unchangingness is conceptually a part of what it means to be a thing. The second that it starts changing, it's no longer a thing. And the way that I like to think of it is that doings aren't things and things aren't doings. So you've got the distinction between the noun and the verb that way. And so I tend to agree with McGilchrist very much because I do think that nature is more of a doing than a thing.
All right. So just to be clear on what you're saying there, that the reason that we've kind of held to this or come to reach this position of things have substance or thinking of reality as a collection of things is because the term that was there had sort of a couple of meanings, but one of those meanings had to do with the fact that it doesn't change. And so if you there is a way, I guess, to retain the thing definition. I know it's
yeah, it's very difficult.
Like,
don't worry, you're not the only one.
Like still within his ontology, McGilchrist's ontology, you could still say they're things, but not that they're things because of some sort of substance that they have, but rather the fact that they do not change.
Well, no, but hold on. But it's not that there's no substance. It's just our concept of substance has to change because we know more about substances. We know more about matter. We know more about things than we did back then. They didn't realize that everything was in motion. We understand that now. So I don't think we should be wedded to. We can recognize the older concepts, but I think our concepts should be allowed to evolve. And
McGilchrist I would anticipate that McGilchrist is explicitly trying to change the notion of these concepts with his new book. Mm-hmm. The thing is that McGilchrist explicitly champions Heraclitus. And Heraclitus was the philosopher of flux or flow or process. He was historically contrasted with Parmenides, who was the philosopher of substance, of being, of the eternal sameness. Like Parmenides explicitly argued that
change does not occur.
Yeah, he said that becoming was an illusion because becoming would imply being not being, and that was a contradiction, and that was absurd. So being was this eternal, unchanging thing that was ubiquitous, basically. It was, and the way of appearances was the way of change, and that was the way of illusion, as opposed to the way of reality or the way of truth.
It's expressed in Zeno's paradox about the arrow that is always moving halfway between one place to the next.
Zeno was
never actually moving.
Yeah, Zeno was a student of Parmenides, and Zeno created the paradoxes because people were criticizing Parmenides on the grounds that his system didn't make sense. And Zeno was replying as, like, he created the paradoxes to make the point that if Parmenides' system didn't make sense, well, that was equally true of the people that were criticizing him. And so his paradoxes were designed to make that point.
It's kind of funny because, like, even today within astrophysics, there's kind of a Parmenides kind of coming back from the dead with the whole block theory of time, where like all of time exists all at once, but it's just there's this illusion of us going through the past into the future, when it in fact everything exists as like one large block or sphere, I guess, of four-dimensional space-time.
Funny, I was thinking the exact same thing. How we get Einstein's relativity, which is in many ways related to this, just because from whatever arbitrary frame of reference you pick, it's not moving, right, unless it's experiencing acceleration. Even then.
Right, so we've got sorry, go ahead.
But yeah, the kind of hidden picture in Einstein's relativity is that if the fourth dimension was extended like the three dimensions are, you get this kind of view of the universe as a perfectly static object. Mm-hmm. Like a block.
But wait, how accepted is that? I mean, I know I find the block theory very unintuitive, and I mean, to me, it seems more likely that the only thing that exists is the present, and the past and future don't exist. But how accepted is the block? Or if you guys know the block theory in terms of physicists?
I've heard like Sean Carroll talking about it, and it seemed like he was like found it plausible.
Yeah, I don't think it's ubiquitous, but I think it's more popular than not. So the people that are still trying to argue for dynamism in some ultimate sense are more or less in the minority at the moment. But I mean, these things kind of, they slip and slide and change. So, the 10 years from now, it could be exactly the opposite.
What are you talking about? Nothing changes.
Anyway, so we have Ben Harrison's watching the chat. He says I think he's talking about McGilchrist, often says it makes more sense to relate to said dynamic processes as though they were people friends, like interacting with a piece of music or a poem like an old friend.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
That seems similar to Vervaeke's, Vervaeke drawing from Pascal, that there's the way in which you interact with the world in regards to objects, and then there's the way in which you interact with the world in regards to persons.
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
Vervaeke put it, the I-thou relationship rather than the I-it relationship.
Yeah, I agree with that absolutely. I think that the spirit of geometry is the spirit of the left hemisphere, and the spirit of finesse is the spirit of the right hemisphere.
The spirit of
and
finesse.
McGilchrist, and McGilchrist is explicitly he's drawing attention to the spirit of finesse. Like that says so much of McGilchrist's project right there, I think.
Yeah, and I think how it, I guess you can map it to Peterson as well, that the spirit of finesse is how you interact with the unknown. Because when I'm interacting with another person, that's I don't know how they're going to react to what I say. So I have to sort of cage my language a little bit to see, to sort of put it lightly, just to see how they react. And then from there, I can respond even further and sort of have this dynamic relationship between the two. But if I'm interacting with my computer, I don't have to change the way I interact with it based off of the new things that it presents to me. I can just react according to it like it's a thing or an object.
It is interesting too that it seems like there is a kind of directionality to this, which is to say the spirit of geometry in some sense has the telos of the spirit of finesse. So there's something about wanting to be able to turn our actions into art itself, right? I was thinking from the point of view of crafting, and how intensely of a geometric mindset it is, quite specifically rotating objects in your head, going through linear processes in order to achieve a desired goal, how to break down the finished product backwards from the raw material.
Be primarily tied just still within the left hemisphere, though, be seeing things in regards to their tool usage rather than
that's what I'm saying is it's starting in this heavily geometric form, but in some sense the goal of the craftsman is to learn all of that so deeply that none of it is a consideration anymore, to be able to have that finessed relationship with the process at hand. Music is perhaps another good example of heavily geometric practice for the sake of no longer having to consider the geometry of what you're doing.
But surely,
go ahead, Brett.
Like having mode shouldn't be, I think, associated with bad or less good than being mode. It seems they both have a place. I mean, we can have. It seems like there are a lot of objects that are useful to just think of as having mode. But then you can have the artistry. You can have a being mode attached to them too. But it doesn't seem that everyone should always be in the being mode, and we should never try to be in having mode.
Right. I do think that McGilchrist is sort of going a little bit too far, and maybe he's overcorrecting intentionally because of just how overemphasized the left hemisphere is within Western culture. He's going so far as to say there are no such things as things. I do agree that you do sort of need to have this conception of things just in order to interact with the world that isn't other people.
It isn't conscious.
What I was pointing to was not to in any way demonize that geometrical mindset. It's entirely necessary and deeply important for learning. However, it does seem like there's a teleological directionality that works well one way and really does not work well the other direction.
But I think this ties into, like we were talking to Viveki about the idea of a dynamic telos.
Yeah.
The static telos doesn't work, and but I do think that the left hemisphere sees things statically, and the mistake comes in with the having mode when we make the having mode teleological. Yes. That's where the problem is. It's a misapplication. It's not that we shouldn't have the having mode. We should have the having mode. We just shouldn't inflate it so that we misapply it. Yes. And so the teleology, I would think, like what we have to do as a culture is to figure out a way of how to describe the teleology in a dynamic way that makes sense.
Right. And I do I strongly, I think, agree with McGilchrist in that the left hemisphere sort of emerges out of having the right hemisphere sort of conception of things, that from having these sorts of implicit values or embodied behaviors, that then from there we can sort of derive these more explicit understandings of either the behaviors or the codification of laws or rules or grammar and things like that, that sort of comes forth out of that. But if you don't have sort of the underlying, I don't know, right hemispheric approach to these things, they're just going to be sort of, he paints this picture towards the end of like a fully left hemispheric dominant world. And it just is incredible to kind of imagine it as being this fully disembodied sort of reality that one would exist within, where all of the information that exists is purely syntactic rather than semantic, and it's all done through sort of abstractions and symbols rather than sort of embodied and feeling and emotional connection to anything that you have. It's interesting to sort of see the exaggerated world that he sort of paints there.
But isn't it true of the world we're currently living in, though?
Yeah.
Well, that's what I was going to say. He almost nudge, wink, wink says, I'm not presenting an exaggerated view of the current world. He does that at the end. And I don't know if I buy it. I mean, it just, I don't know. Yeah, there are times we focus on those aspects, but it seems that there are plenty of times we also focus on on the zooming out. I always think in terms of zooming in and zooming out. And it seems like a bit of cherry picking to only focus on the parts he doesn't like and then ignore that there's a lot of other people who are looking at the big picture and thinking policy. And
the fact that the people are looking at the big picture doesn't really impact the way that the culture as a whole is moving. The issue is that the institutions and so on and so forth, they are all operating according to this left hemisphere paradigm, and the left hemisphere paradigm excludes and ignores the right hemisphere paradigm, so that it becomes insular in such a way that we suffer from all of the things that McGilchrist basically described. So he's convinced me, basically.
I was going to draw a connection there to Vervaeke's work at the beginning of his series in regards to the meaning crisis, that we have all these institutions that are no longer working for the people within them, that the people have become disenfranchised with all of the various political, religious, educational, these types of institutions that are out there. And so this is, you could maybe see it as a bit of a expression of McGilchrist's point, that people are these things that our system of society is relying off of isn't deeply connected to the underlying like emotional creatures underneath them, the right hemispheric sort of people that have feelings and connections and emotional bonds with other people and social community aspects as well.
Like I may be projecting a bit too, because I know for me, for a number of years, I've always thought it important both, again, to zoom in and zoom out. And I've tried to do both quite consciously. So maybe I'm projecting that a lot of people do that, and maybe not, maybe a lot of people don't, but I still see, I know just in all sorts of arguments, when I've been on an argument and I've been focusing on the small details, somebody else says, well, look at the big picture, and vice versa. So I get what you're saying, I guess, but I
going by the evidence that I'm familiar with, you struck up a friendship over Twitter while arguing about theology. I would say that anything that you have to say about open-mindedness and how open-minded people generally are is excluded by virtue of that. You are clearly an unusual individual.
Well, I don't know, maybe, but that's what I'm trying to work on, but to make it less unusual. But yeah, so I again, I may be projecting, but I still, but I guess part of it is I see all sorts of people. Like sometimes I think people don't seem to. Well, maybe it's involving religion a lot. In a lot of my religious discussions, I see people focusing on the big picture and not necessarily zooming into the smaller details.
I want to pitch something to you, Brett, and see, and
Yeah,
you can tell me whether or not you like it. What do you think of the idea that the left hemisphere way of looking at things is like the participatory knowing, the propositional knowing that Viveki talks about, and the right hemisphere way of looking at things is like the participatory way of looking at things?
yeah, or I would think like the left is looking at the particulars and the right is looking at the gestalt. Is that
right?
That's how I sort of think about it. That's how I'm starting to understand it, and I think
that's valid. But if you try and say, well, I guess in that case the question would be: is how much is the participatory like the gestalt, and how much is the propositional like the particular?
I think the sort of clarification point that Brett is like, there's a way that you can kind of see the gestalt within propositional knowledge, and there's also the way that you can see the gestalt within participatory knowledge.
Yes, exactly.
And vice versa, where you can see the particulars within their participation, and then also the particulars within propositional. Because the 4 Ps are the ways of knowing, whereas the I don't know.
I do tend to think that the left hemisphere will prioritize propositional knowledge, and the right hemisphere will prioritize participatory knowledge.
Yeah, I do agree with that, since the propositional is sort of like extracting from the emotional connection towards having this sort of like abstract symbolic expression of what a thing is. Like we can have this sort of fact about reality. Yeah.
Likewise, procedural knowledge we could consider to be the participatory or embodied form of left brain dominant knowing.
I guess, but you need all sorts of procedures. Like if you're running a company, you need procedures that micromanage, but you also need wide policy procedures that take in the gestalt, right? So you always need both, and companies tend to have these. Like you have the company has the culture and the the what's it called, the mandate, and not the mandate, the what's the word where they have like a phrase that represents them?
The mantra, yeah, or the maxim, or whatever.
I know that.
Something like that.
I know that carrying out procedures is seen as a left hemisphere thing because the left hemisphere is so good at routine, but I don't necessarily think that procedural knowledge is routine as such. And I'd like to give the example of Freddie Mercury singing up on stage. Like there was nothing rote about that when he was singing up on stage while he was giving the performance. The procedure was excellent, but it was also the spontaneous thing, and it was the spontaneity which made it such a lively expression. And so I don't think that
right. Well, I don't think it would be fair to characterize that performance as strictly in the domain of procedural knowing. Okay, right. It's also deeply participatory. He's interacting with the audience. It might be very different from when he's like, practicing how to hit a specific note in a specific way while he's at home to prepare. Right. That might be more deeply procedural.
But well, I don't know. I tend to like. I mean, what you're talking about, we would procedural knowledge is knowledge of how to ride a bike, but there's riding a bike is in knowing, okay, I've got to pedal, and that's the superficial. But the procedural knowledge has the higher order knowledge in that eventually you forget about the cycling and you're just focusing on where you're going. And the focusing on where you're going is much more spontaneous. It's not something that well, I suppose where you usually know.
But you're switching knowledge domains when that happens.
Well, what I'm trying to get at is how would you categorize the
you just described that. What you just described is the two aspects of procedural knowing that are both zoomed in and zoomed out, right?
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. It gets kind of complicated. I guess what I was trying to ask Nick is, where does the procedural stop and the participatory start?
Yeah, I think there's likely a tremendous amount of overlap.
Right,
But I
because
do
you're doing
think
it at
that
the
it's
same
quite
time.
phenomenologically real when we feel ourselves switch from a procedural mindset into a participatory mindset, even if we're carrying out a similar action, say in the case of riding the bike.
Well, maybe we need to clarify what's the difference between participatory and perspectival. Like perspectival, I think of as the qualia type knowing. And
I think this, yeah, that's difficult. And are we trying to use Vivek's terminology, or are we trying to use our own idea of the terminology? That's basically well, that's my first question to you, Brett. Like, do we want Vivek's understanding, or
well, I guess both, but I'm trying to understand it in the Vervikian.
Well, and again, it makes sense to me then to map perspectival as the right hemisphere's particular, the zoom in of right dominant understanding.
Here's what I think. I think that the left hemisphere is, well, the left hemisphere taking care of itself, that's propositional. The left hemisphere controlling the right hemisphere, that's procedural. The right hemisphere controlling the left hemisphere, that's perspectival. And then the right hemisphere doing its own thing, that's participatory. So
yeah, I think that's probably a good map.
Yeah. So what I would, and this actually gets into, I think that maps on very strongly with Jordan Peterson, because, and how this video first came up as a discussion point was because I wanted to challenge Nick on the fourth kind of meaning, where the three kinds of meaning is what I think the three kinds of meaning is trying to point out at is the first kind of meaning is the meaning of the known is the meaning of the left hemisphere. The meaning of the unknown is the meaning of the right hemisphere. And then the third kind of meaning is the meaning that you get when they both overlapping in a harmonious way. Mm. So the opposition comes together to form a greater whole, so to speak. With Vivek's understanding of the four kinds of knowing, I think he's organized it into a hierarchy so that the perspectival emerges out of the participatory, the procedural emerges out of the perspectival, and then the propositional emerges out of the procedural. I'm not quite sure about, like, I would differ with Vivek, because I think that he interprets the perspectival in a dynamic way. And I'm not sure if that's correct. I think I'm more comfortable interpreting it in a more static way. And I think that, well, fundamentally, what I would think that the perspective is like, it's the more subjective elements. But I don't mean subjective in the sense of like subjective, objective. I mean, it's more like the
having an experience that you can't describe the color. You have an experience. You have
it's
experience of red.
It's more like the context versus the text. It's what's not in the text. The perspective is the stuff that makes up the context, and then the propositional would be what makes up the text. And so the perspectival is how the text relates to itself, shall we say? That's poorly phrased, but that's how I tend to try and think of it. Does it land at all?
Yeah, I've just always thought the perspectival is like the quality experience, but maybe I've got it.
No, I'm not disagreeing with that. I think that what I'm saying actually incorporates that, but well, that would take a long time.
Because almost context could still be propositional, right? Like you can propose what the context is, right?
Well, that would be converting the perspectival into the propositional. Like I can make propositions about my perspective, right?
Right. Yeah.
But it'd still be leaving out something of what the perspective experience itself is like.
Yeah, but then what we're leaving out would be the parts that is the context that can't be put in the text. So I agree with you, but you're making my point for me.
Yeah.
Okay, so did you?
I think that's good.
Yeah. So Nick, did you want to maybe lay out what you had said our last conversation, that it seemed like Peterson was sort of leaving out in regards to a sense of meaning that, or a sense of narrative that can be had without his sort of framing of meaning. Or
right. Well, I mean, the basic thrust of my argument was just that he framed all of meaning as basically relating to problem solving. right? Encountering a problem and then navigating the situation. And out of that navigation, we experience meaning. And then my only thing was that is obviously very true, but it seems to leave out an entire other system by which we experience meaning, which largely comes not from moving from a lack to a state of fulfillment, but starting from an excess and in some sense, letting go of that excess, right?
Would
and,
you
go ahead?
Yeah, would you agree with the idea that Peterson is using the idea of a problem because insofar as the right hemisphere sees uncertainty, it does see problems? Would it be fair?
Does the right hemisphere encounter uncertainty as a problem?
If the right hemisphere is based around finding predators or like being aware of other predators around it, it is going to sort of take that in as a problem, I would say.
Yeah, it's a potential danger. The left hemisphere has an overwhelming, well, not overwhelming, but it does have a bias towards positive information, and the right hemisphere does have a bias towards negative information. It's a real problem with people that have had right hemisphere damage, that they become unable to properly deal with negative information. Like the left hemisphere basically just ignores it. And so to capture, it's almost like the left hemisphere sees solutions and the right hemisphere sees problems.
Like neuroticism might be a right hemispheric dominant trait then.
It depends. I would kind of agree, like, well, it depends. What kind of neuroticism are you talking about? How are you
like from the Ocean, the big five neuroticism in regards to personality?
Okay, I have theories about that. I will say that people who are high in openness, and I do think that people who are high in openness will have a highly developed right hemisphere, but they are more prone to worry. So if you equate worry with neuroticism, then yes.
Okay. Yeah, probably.
But I kind of think that actually what neuroticism really is there's two kinds of it. Colin DeYoung, who was a student of Jordan Peterson, made the 10 facets of the Big Five, and he broke up neuroticism into volatility and withdrawal. And I've just got to think, if I remember correctly.
Is it kind of like breaking it up, the Big Five, and then there's also extroversion and introversion that sort of like qualify or modify each of those Big Five personality traits?
Well, okay, that depends on how you want to characterize the higher order factors. Like the extroversion thing is kind of confusing because it
this might be going off into a trail that's not really necessary.
Sorry, but I'll try and just briefly explain it. But you see that it goes to Jung because Jung had a different idea of what extroversion and introversion is. And then the Big Five, it doesn't quite align with that, but people kind of appropriated the Jungian terminology and try to transplant it. So now you get this weird thing like, I mean, I can talk about trait openness, but if I talk about trait closedness, nobody knows what the hell I'm talking about. And for trait extroversion, there's this, it's different because you can talk about trait extroversion and trait introversion. And I actually tend to think that trait introversion isn't actually a thing. Like trait closedness isn't a thing. You don't describe something by, well, if something is a lack, it's not a thing in itself, basically. So I'm dubious regarding introversion. The thing about neuroticism, and this is just a theory of mine personally, is that there are two stable relationships, I think. And the stable relationship is like the conflict between conscientiousness and openness. And Peterson goes into that in quite great detail with regards to his discussion on borders, because the open people want the open borders, the conscientious people want the closed borders. The other one that I think that is stable is the opposition between extroversion and agreeableness. But I think where neuroticism comes in is that neuroticism is the conflict between conscientiousness and agreeableness on the one hand, and then the conflict between extroversion and openness on the other hand. I think that those two, when those two personality forms start, those four, but when that particular combination, those two combinations hit, then that's when the neurotic behavior starts to manifest. And the reason that I think that is because I don't know if you're familiar with the 4 Fs in it's the fight, flight, freeze, fawn system.
Yeah.
I think that fundamentally trait conscientiousness is an outgrowth of the fight system. Extroversion is a outgrowth of the flight system, and then openness is an outgrowth of the freeze system, and then agreeableness is an outgrowth of the fawn system. Or these are the emergency forms of like fight is the emergency form of conscientiousness, so on and so forth.
All right.
But the bottom line is, sorry, last thing is that you see, like when you have fight and fawn conflicting with each other, they don't agree at all, and like flight and freeze don't agree at all. Like their mission statements are 180 degrees opposed to each other, and it's the conflict that produces the neuroticism, because there's no ability to resolve which way to go forward. Anyway, sorry.
Yeah, I can definitely see that in regards to anxiety, but I don't know, the way that I sort of understand neuroticism is like there's some sort of like threat or danger that's maybe I guess that's like anxiety really,
it's understood as a greater sensitivity towards negative information. But now the question is that negativity like
so going back to the point that Nick was making, is there a way to sort of bring it, like I think Nick has made a strong point that there is this phenomenological way in which to approach, or this does happen on occasions where you can have a sort of narrative story for like what to do without having to frame it in regards to problem solving. And so is there a way to sort of fit that within either Peterson's model or McGilchrist model?
I don't know. I mean, I tend to agree with Nick, and I think that there are meanings that are not necessarily related directly to action. But insofar as you're acting in the world, to say that you're acting in the world and not solving a problem, that's a much harder sell.
I don't think he's saying that it's not directly related to action. It's just not directly related to fixing something.
No. Yeah, Nick, you're muted there. Can you tag in by any chance?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's the line that stood out to me for kind of making this case in the paper that we read on the last show was that the only benefit of achieving the goal in the Petersonian method is a temporary relief from the problem-solving mindset. So it's just like a quick little, I get to relax, and now I'm back into my whole shtick. And it to me, that's to roll the boulder back up the hill. Yeah, exactly. It's very Sisyphus inspired.
Okay, so you basically think that there's something missing.
Sorry. Yeah, and I again, it's like I've had experiences where this is a deep phenomenological reality, and the sense of meaning that I had from those experiences vastly was almost exponentially higher than the sense of meaning I got from solving a problem.
Can I ask you, this might sound like a strange question, but did you have a strong sense of surrender in those experiences?
Yes. Again, and I tried to use that in the conversation. I used as a metaphor breathing, right? So every time we breathe in, we have to engage muscles. There's no way to breathe in where it's a relaxing mode, right? You always have to engage. But breathing out, you can do it as an engaging mode, right? You can force your breath out or sink below the resting point of the breath, right? By pushing on the diaphragm. But there is the form of releasing breath that is just letting go, just relaxing, right? Surrendering to the outflow of the breath. And to me, that's the parallel I was trying to draw with meaning, right? We can do it on the up cycle or on the down cycle, and they have antithetical shapes.
Yeah, that's a very good metaphor to tie to it.
The thing that I find interesting, though, is that if you think about it, if the left hemisphere is the predator, and the right hemisphere is the prey, then the act of surrendering to the predator is kind of like a rejection of the problem solution paradigm in the first place. It's like kind of accepting the problem as the solution.
Right.
And I just find that
Well, hold on.
But that's my point. Is I'm trying to throw out the problem thing. What I'm not trying to do is throw out meaning along with it.
Right.
I'm trying to preserve meaning and throw out the problem aspect.
Yeah. What I'm trying to say is I just think it's kind of interesting. It sounds to me very much like a right hemisphere rejection of the left hemisphere's way of looking at things. That's.
I mean, yeah, well, to some degree, but
yeah, I guess so.
I don't know. Again, phenomenologically, it's not like that part just disappears. It just becomes entirely subservient. Would perhaps be you're not flipping in dominance. So in that regard, there is a surrender, but it doesn't mean like half the brain just stops working.
Right.
It's put into service, if you will.
That's interesting. Okay. Yeah. One of the particularly interesting things from this talk from McGilchrist is all of his sort of studies on the people with stroke, the stroke patients, that people who have had some sort of stroke and made it so one of their hemispheres is entirely dominant, and to sort of see the differences that are there between how people normally go about things and then the people that no longer have access to one or the other of the hemispheres. That's pretty fascinating. Welcome, Tyler. Did you, Brett, do you want to maybe lay out a couple of those? I know you've got some pictures as well from some of the stuff there.
I think he just said he's going to.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm a little distracted by some stuff that's going on off stream. So sorry, I was okay. Yeah, I wasn't paying
that's
full
right.
attention there. And I think I'm actually gonna have to run in a minute. But yeah, I think I'm just gonna have to go now. But thanks for having me. Sorry, I have to duck out early.
No problem.
And yeah, this good discussion. It was a good video. I mean, the only thing I would have wanted to chat about is I think it's really interesting what he says about how we think about the world. Sort of, if we see the world as a machine, we'll see it as a machine. If we see it think of it as a living being, we'll see it as a living being. And my only point there is that that's probably true, but that's why we want people with diverse views. We want people who see it as a machine. We want people who see it as a living being, and we want them to interact with each other so we have the benefit of the things that each pick out. We run into problems when we think, well, we should all see it the way I see it.
Yeah.
And thinking that that's a good thing. And I'm not sure that is a great thing.
Yeah. That's a very good point there.
Yeah. To pick up on what you said earlier, John, I very much think that McGilchrist is a reactionary. And the problem with reactionaries, and this is not a criticism of McGilchrist, is that they have to go too far. And so McGilchrist does go too far. He does speak too strongly in favor of the right hemisphere, but that, like, we need him to do that in order to be a corrective against the left hemisphere dominated way. But Brett's very, very right. We don't want either the right hemisphere or the left hemisphere. What we want is both opposing points of view coming together and the interface building, well, something that's productive that actually works in favor of both sides.
Legitimate synthesis.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I remember in his conversation with Peterson, he sort of thought of himself as a Hegelian. So maybe it's the case that he's trying to bring up that antithesis to the sort of like hard left hemispheric way of approaching things that our modern society has been doing, just so that we can get some sort of better synthesis to come about. So.
Yeah, I basically think that all reactionaries have to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, all right. So yeah, thanks, Brett. Hey, Tyler, is there something that you? I don't know. I don't know if you've
See you later,
watched
guys.
it. Yeah. See you, Brett.
See you, Brett.
I don't know if there's anything from this lecture that you've watched, or I know you've been following McGilchrist for quite a while and quite the fanboy of his.
Fanboy?
Yeah.
Yeah, I am a big fanboy. I've got a poster on the wall over there.
Half a poster, only half a poster.
You know, one day we may have McGilchrist posters, right? Like,
that'd be pretty impressive.
The merch machine is pretty wild. No, I don't want to extend this any further. I can see you guys kind of want to wind it down. That's fine. I just squeezed out of what I was doing over there. Okay. Did Pod talk about Vervaeke's Discord at all? Did he?
Oh no, yeah. Well, I can mention it right now. Pod is working on a Discord for John Vervaeke, and I can actually see if I can share it in the chat. But yeah, and so far, Vervaeke has been in contact with him, and they've been working together on that somewhat. And so, yeah, so it's pretty interesting seeing some of the stuff that's going on there with him. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he may be popping in there soon, so I think that's why.
I think he just did, actually.
Oh, he did? Okay, cool. So
yeah, that's why Brett had to run.
Sure. All right. So yeah, maybe we can wrap up, unless there's like some other main points from this talk that people might want to go into.
Yeah, I don't know. This one was really off the wall for me. I basically said everything that I wanted to say to Nick. Your choice to make this video a video for the week kind of surprised me, but I do actually have a recommendation for next week as a result, and that is Michael Hudson's work on debt, which I think would be quite a big paradigm shift. But if you're looking for new content, that's where I would go.
I think the real value in McGilchrist's work is at the neuroscience and the cognitive science level. It's attempting to take a kind of meta approach, kind of a meta modern approach, I think, in fact, in an attempt to abstract it into the philosophical realm and the theological realm. And yeah, I think when you get down into the nitty gritty of his depiction of how things are functioning and how it is that the structures of the brain and how it is that the particular filters of the mind influence the way that we go about behaving in the world and perceiving the world, I think that's all pretty good and valuable stuff.
I agree with you completely. I would even go further than that. I think that basically McGilchrist is almost reversing 2,500 years of language development. Like the way that he describes the development of language, he's explicitly subverting many of those moves in the approach that he takes. And once you start looking at the kinds of implications that has for everything, it's very clear to see how his cognitive science informs things like his theology, and how the thing that really strikes me about McGilchrist is the squaring of the circle in alchemy. Like if you look at what the symbolism of the square means versus the symbolism of the circle, the square symbolism basically all boils down to the symbolism of all the things that the left hemisphere basically is interested in is encapsulated in the symbol of the square. And for the circle, everything that the right hemisphere is basically interested in, the circle symbolizes that. And so I kind of think that McGilchrist has picked up on this somehow, and I wouldn't be surprised if part of his movement is actually a resurrection of a lost ancient language as a result. I don't know, but that might be me overstating things.
Yeah, I do know, like, for the ancient Greeks, the circle sort of was perfect because it had no like direct sides to it. It had sort of like an infinite amount of sides around it. So there's sort of this connection between infinity and the circle there. Yeah,
the circle was continuous and the square was discrete. And the discreteness, you see, like McGilchrist talks about the and it was the, like, there's a screenshot, the lecture where he compares the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere, and he has the left hemisphere's fixity and the right hemisphere's flow, and the circle symbolized the dynamic and the square symbolized the static. And then obviously, like I said, the square is the particular and the circle is the whole. And all of those things, like it's just amazing to me. Well, I have the suspicion that people discovered these things that McGilchrist is discovering about the brain before, and the alchemical system ultimately, although it's heavily garbled, is basically the repository of knowledge that remains over from that. And I see you smiling, so
No, I'm all into this type of stuff. Like the last quarter of Peterson's first book, Maps of Meaning, delves right into alchemy, and like he gets pretty far out there for some of it. And like I'm always interested in that type of stuff. It's very
no,
interesting.
I'm a real sucker for that stuff, as you can clearly hear.
All right, yeah, we should wrap up here. It's a shorter one today, but the thing that we were discussing wasn't that dense, so that hopefully it helped out some people being able to check that out without having to have a whole like 50 hours of background knowledge in order to understand what the hell we're talking about. So yeah, I think what we're going to be doing soon is have some sort of like polling for like what should we talk about next week. That way we can actually be able to figure it out ahead of time and also get a little bit of unanimous voting or democratic voting sort of taking place rather than just somebody choosing what we do and then going off of that even before we figured out what
Your choice wasn't that bad, John.
Yeah, it could have been better, but this was fine. So yeah, thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks Brett for coming in, and also Nick and Daelric and Tyler as well. So yeah, join us in the Discord as well, and check out I added a link in the live chat there for the Vervaeke Discord as well. So probably a lot of our audience would be interested in that. So yeah, have a wonderful Sunday, everybody.
Sweet.